Jimo Borjigin, who chose the path of neurobiology, understood that death is an inevitable part of existence. However, she one day encountered a surprising paradox. More than 10 years ago, when she was just beginning her career at the University of Michigan, she discovered that scientific understanding of what happens in the brain at the moment of death was virtually non-existent. This discovery became a true challenge for her and the impetus for new research. It all began with a routine laboratory experiment on rats that had recently undergone surgery. The goal was to study neurochemical changes after the operation. During the observation process, 2 of the rats died, unexpectedly providing the opportunity to study the brain in detail at the moment of death. Then, Jimo noticed a sharp surge of serotonin, a hormone that can cause hallucinations. This fact sparked a question in her. Could animals experience something similar to visions at the brink of death? An in-depth analysis of the scientific literature yielded no answers. Research into the processes that occur during brain death turned out to be extremely limited. Shocked by this gap in knowledge, Jimo decided to dedicate herself to studying this very topic. Her credo is to debunk common myths and uncover the true mechanisms governing brain activity during the final moments of life. Traditionally, the medical community defines death by cardiac arrest. When a person suddenly loses consciousness and their body stops responding, doctors check for a pulse. If there is no pulse, clinical death is declared as the heart stops pumping blood and oxygen is deprived of the brain. This entire process is recorded by an electrocardiogram and other methods. However, this focus on the heart obscures the fact that the brain plays a crucial role in sustaining life.
The brain requires enormous amounts of oxygen. When the heart stops, the oxygen supply is cut off and it would seem that brain function ceases. But this is where the most intriguing discoveries arise. In Jimo's experiments on rats, a sharp surge in neurochemical activity was observed after cardiac arrest. Serotonin levels rose 60 times higher than normal. Dopamine levels, the hormone of joy, increased 40 to 50 times. And norepinephrine, which is responsible for attention, also spiked. An atypical brain response bridged conventional notions of death with scientific reality. Research showed that the dying brain enters a state of hyperactivity. In 2015, Jimo and her team confirmed this observation, noting that all test animals showed intense brain activity at the moment of death. This shift invalidated the long-held notion that the brain simply shuts down when the heart stops. A subsequent human study using electroencephalography, EEG, in 2023 examined comatose patients connected to life support. In 4 patients dying from various illnesses, a sudden spike in brain activity, including a burst of gamma waves, was detected after the machines were disconnected. These rapid fluctuations are associated with complex information processing at the cognitive level. Activity was concentrated in areas of the brain that control consciousness, perception, speech, and memory. Among these, the temporoparietal junction, Wernicke's area, and the temporal lobe stood out. These areas are responsible for feelings, speech comprehension, and emotional perception. The temporal lobe was particularly prominent. It's associated not only with memory, but also with empathy. It was in this area that people recovering from cardiac arrest reported changes in perception and feeling. This discovery provides a key to understanding the phenomenon of near-death experiences. Accounts of patients who have experienced clinical death often include visions of light, memories of life, or the sensation of leaving the body. Such accounts, previously considered mystical, are now gaining scientific validity. Visual cortex activity recorded in patients may explain visions of bright light, while activation of language areas may explain the perception of sounds and conversations. The paradox discovered by Jimo Borjigin forces us to reconsider our conventional views on what happens at the moment of death. For centuries, the heart was considered the primary indicator of vitality, and the brain was considered merely an innocent bystander that ceases functioning when the heart stops. It is now clear that the brain is capable of a powerful surge of activity. This fact changes our understanding not only of the physiology of death, but also of its subjective perception. Despite the obvious surge in activity, the mechanism behind this phenomenon remains a mystery. Borjigin suggests that this brain peak is the result of an evolutionary mechanism for surviving oxygen deficiency. Under extreme conditions, the brain begins to conserve resources and focuses on maintaining vital functions. The analogy of a family that has lost income helps us understand how the brain redistributes its oxygen budget, preserving key processes. The researcher acknowledges that this is only the beginning of a journey toward understanding the complex processes that accompany the transition from life to death. She is convinced that this area holds many unexplored aspects that could significantly change our understanding of the boundaries between life and death. Her work raises questions about the extent to which doctors prematurely declare death and the impact this has on patients. These new findings open the way to a more in-depth study of brain activity during critical moments in life. After all, if the brain is capable of activating at the peak of an extreme state, this could open the door to new medical approaches. The relationship between heart and brain function is proving to be much more complex than previously thought, and continued research holds great promise. Thus, at the intersection of medical technology and consciousness science, Jimo Borjigin opens a new chapter in our understanding of death and what happens within us when it seems like everything is ending. Her story and discoveries are an invitation to further exploration of the mysteries of the brain and the enigmas of life. This is precisely what she is doing and will continue to do, inviting the world to rethink fundamental questions. It's impossible not to feel awe at the vastness of the horizon being conquered. Many amazing discoveries lie ahead, ones that will help answer questions that seemed unanswerable for centuries. Meanwhile, new research is already changing us and our view of the phenomenon of death itself, opening the door to the unknown. Mechanisms of brain activity on the brink of life and death. Jimo Borjigin, who began her career in neurobiology with a clear understanding of the inevitability of death, was confronted with the astonishing discovery that the processes in the dying brain remain virtually unexplored. This insight arose accidentally during experiments on rats that had recently undergone surgery. The moment of death in 2 rodents allowed her to study in detail brain activity previously thought impossible during clinical death. During these studies, Borjigin discovered a sharp surge in serotonin, a hormone with hallucinogenic effects, which prompted her to wonder, do animals experience something akin to visions at this moment? Attempts to find explanations in the scientific literature only confirmed the enormous gap in knowledge. Thus began a multi-year effort to understand the mystery of the dying brain in humans and animals. Traditional concepts of death emphasized cardiac arrest, considered a signal of the cessation of oxygen supply to the brain, and, consequently, the complete loss of brain activity. Doctors typically relied on the pulse and electrocardiogram to confirm clinical death, with the brain relegated to a passive role. However, Bourjighen's experiments challenged these dogmas. Studying the release of neurotransmitters in dying rats, the team discovered that after cardiac arrest, serotonin levels increased 60-fold. Dopamine, the pleasure hormone, increased 40 to 60 times, and norepinephrine, which is responsible for attention, also increased significantly. These unlikely findings prompted a deeper study of the phenomenon, as such activity had not been recorded in living animals under normal conditions. Subsequent experiments in 2015 confirmed that the brain enters an unusual hyperactive state at the moment of death. The study's results showed that this state invariably occurs in 100% of test rats at the moment of cardiac arrest. This meant that the brain temporarily activates despite the lack of oxygen and blood supply, overturning conventional wisdom. A particularly important step was the study of the brains of dying people in the years after the 20th century. 4 comatose patients connected to life support machines with electroencephalography electrodes were studied in their final minutes. The abrupt disconnection of the machines triggered a sudden spike in activity in 2 of them, including gamma waves, the fastest types of brain activity responsible for high-level information processing and memory. Generalized hypoxia, which occurs when ventilators are disconnected, triggers a sharp activation of the brain, revealing that the brain doesn't slow down. In humans, unlike in rats, the active areas were localized, particularly in those responsible for perception, speech, and consciousness. This indicated a link between brain activity and cognitive function, even in the face of life and death. Specifically, areas of activity included the temporoparietal junction, which is responsible for sensory perception, dreams, and visual hallucinations. Another area, Wernicke's area, is associated with speech comprehension and auditory perception. The most powerful activity was observed in the temporal lobe of the brain, which is responsible for memory and empathy. According to Bourjighen, it is through this lobe that altered consciousness may occur in those who have experienced clinical death. This scientific fact is similar to numerous stories from the field of near-death experiences. People who have survived cardiac arrest have described vivid visions, out-of-body experiences, and encounters with an unknown light. Bourjighen is confident that these phenomena are linked to the intense burst of brain activity recorded in her research. Active brain areas correlated with a subjective perception of light and sound, providing compelling evidence of the biological origin of these experiences. Interestingly, many patients reported hearing the speech and actions of medical personnel during resuscitation despite being unconscious. Studies confirm that 2 out of 4 patients who died showed activation of the area responsible for speech functions. These findings are puzzling and challenge the traditional distinction between the functions of the heart and the brain, demonstrating their far more complex and interdependent nature. This contradiction has created a real mystery. The official medical understanding of death centers on the cessation of cardiac activity, which is by default assumed to be the moment of cessation of brain activity. However, evidence from near-death experiences suggests otherwise. The brain functions at its peak even when the patient is outwardly declared dead. Bourjighen rejects the idea that these experiences arise from sources external to the body. She is convinced that the activity originates within the brain itself, as confirmed by biological measurements. This completely changes the perception of death. Consciousness and perception can persist even when the heart no longer beats, and blood ceases to flow. Noting that human studies are still limited, Jimo emphasizes that the key to unlocking the mystery lies in further understanding the brain's response to oxygen deprivation, known as hypoxia. It is believed that brain activity at critical moments is part of an evolutionary survival mechanism, when the brain mobilizes its remaining resources to minimize damage and potentially recover. The brain isn't passive. On the contrary, it locks into economy mode and redistributes oxygen and energy to vital functions, primarily maintaining respiration and cardiac function. This strategy can be compared to a family budget during a crisis, when resources are spent only on the bare necessities of survival. This survival mode implies that the brain actively prepares for a biological crisis, stimulating brain activity to prolong life. Bourdieu believes this is a kind of last stand for the brain against the inevitability of death. In this context, the study of neurobiological processes is still only scratching the surface, like the tip of an iceberg concealing many secrets and unknown mechanisms. The underwater part of this iceberg is the endogenous mechanisms that protect nervous tissue from oxygen deficiency, which are still poorly understood but extremely important. Science is only beginning to understand that the brain can combat hypoxia much more effectively than previously thought, which could open new avenues for saving patients and changing the criteria for diagnosing death. According to Bourdieu, millions of people worldwide may be receiving premature death diagnoses, as the mechanism of transition between life and death is more complex and profound than previously thought. Her research calls for a rethinking of clinical death assessments, focusing on brain activity and cognitive functions in the final moments of life. These discoveries not only expand our understanding of the brain and death, but also force us to rethink the experience and nature of human consciousness in critical situations. The next chapter will continue to explore new horizons in understanding death and life through the lens of neuroscience, delving deeper into the mechanisms and capabilities of the brain in extreme situations. Near-death experiences and a new perspective on death. The experiences of patients who have experienced clinical death have long attracted the attention of scientists and philosophers. Many have reported exceptional cases in which consciousness seemed to detach from the body, enveloped in light, and memories of their entire lives were recalled. These vivid experiences were long perceived as manifestations of a mysterious afterlife. But Yumi Bourdieu insists on a different explanation. Her research suggests that all these phenomena are related to active brain function at the moment of cardiac arrest. The scientist is confident that peak brain activity during the critical phase of hypoxia is not only possible, but also serves as a biological survival mechanism. According to her, it is at this moment that complex neurochemical processes are triggered, which can explain a number of unique physiological and psychological phenomena. The emergence of gamma rhythms and a sharp release of neurotransmitters indicate that the brain is not simply shutting down, but entering a state of heightened activity, which radically changes our understanding of death as a complete cessation of all functions. Bourdieu pays special attention to the areas of the cerebral cortex that are activated in the final moments of life. The temporoparietal junction and Wernicke's area, responsible for perception, memory, and language, become active even after doctors declare clinical death. These areas are associated with the processing of visual and auditory information, which may well explain patients' reports of seeing lights and hearing voices during cardiac arrest. Scientific data from modern research has shattered long-held stereotypes entrenched in medical protocols. Until recently, it was believed that the brain dies immediately after cardiac arrest, as its oxygen supply is disrupted. However, observations by Borjigin and her team demonstrate the opposite. The brain initially activates sharply, possibly attempting to compensate for the oxygen deficit and prepare for extreme stress or recovery. Yumi poses a pressing question. Why? Precisely at the moment of crossing the line between life and death, does the brain display such intense activity when, in theory, it should gradually fade? She believes this is not a coincidence, but the result of an evolutionary acquisition, a complex neuropsychological response to catastrophic oxygen deficiency. Like a family that, when faced with a loss of income, cuts expenses to the bare essentials, the brain switches to survival mode, diverting oxygen and energy specifically to vital processes. The contrast between clinical concepts of death and direct observations forces us to rethink the concepts of life and consciousness. If the music of the brain resounds loud and clear in the final seconds, then perhaps the conscious experiences of a terminally ill person are not illusions or hallucinations, but the result of intense internal activity. This opens new horizons for understanding the soul, consciousness, and the boundaries of human experience. The link between activation of the right temporoparietal lobe and empathic expression in patients who survived cardiac arrest is particularly striking. Numerous testimonies indicate that such experiences can transform a person, enhancing their spiritual depth and capacity for empathy. Borjigin speaks respectfully of those who have recounted their experiences, believing that had some patients survived, they would have corroborated these accounts. Her perspective challenges the traditional medical paradigm, which encourages us to view death as a certain and definitive end to brain activity. She argues that doctors often prematurely pronounce death without understanding the true mechanisms by which the brain enters a state of hyperactive rest or another, as yet unexplored, state. This gap in knowledge requires immediate attention and new research. Yumi dreams of expanding the boundaries of scientific understanding, not only to rewrite textbooks, but also to improve the quality of palliative care and resuscitation practices. She is confident that discovering the mechanisms by which the brain combats hypoxia will help more effectively protect critically ill patients and even transcend the boundaries of death. The evolutionary survival mechanism of brain activation should be recognized as the key to understanding the mystical, yet scientifically explainable, near-death experiences. Despite the complexity of the topic, Borjigin remains optimistic, viewing the brain not as a passive victim of death, but as a remarkable organ capable of fighting for every second of life. The researcher is confident that only through the combined efforts of physicians, neuroscientists, and philosophers can a breakthrough be achieved in understanding what happens to consciousness on the brink of the disappearance of biological functions. In the future, studying peaks in brain activity and its role in the formation of unique experiences may not only help unlock the mysteries of consciousness, but also develop new treatments for incurable conditions. Borjigin sees a vast scientific frontier ahead, where myths meet facts, and where humanity is taking a step toward a new era of knowledge. Moving beyond the study of cognitive processes in the dying brain, we find ourselves at the threshold of the next chapter, which will examine specific research methods and prospects for clinical application of these astonishing discoveries. How will our understanding of death change if the brain truly takes much longer than previously thought to prepare for its final conscious journey? These questions will be the subject of further reflection and research.